One of my fondest memories from childhood is playing catch with my dad, right? I can think of, Dad, throw a high fly, catch it, and bursting with joy, throwing it back. See, my dad he worked a back-breaking manual labor type job that often required him to work a lot of hours. So he wasn't around a whole lot. And on top of that, my dad was a man of few words, right? So if you think about as a young boy trying to find meaningful interaction with his father, and you have these barriers of time and personality, there was a lot of challenges I found, but there was something magical about this simple act of playing catch. Right? For me and my dad, playing catch out in the yard provided an opening and a window to make connections that little else I could see in our lives. And that we have a bond that still is alive today based on some of those connections early in our lives. So what I want to do is share a few core ways, 3 core ways that I think sport helps us in a transformative way. Right? The first one I think about historically, sport and sport figures have always found a way to be at the forefront of social change, and to talk about how there's a social problem here, and as a culture we need to do something about it. Right? Illuminate social injustice and try to promote social justice. What are a couple examples? I'm sure just as I say that, some of you are probably thinking about them. The one area I always think about is the iconic image of John Carlos and Tommie Smith at the 1968 Mexico City Olympics. People remember this? Right, this image where they stood on the medal stand accepting their gold and silver medals, and they were protesting racial injustice and racial inequality in the United States and broadly, right? And I think about that image, and I have this image on my wall in my office as a reminder of what the stakes are when we're talking about trying to use personal courage and power, because if you think about this, these two gentlemen, they knew that if they displayed some type of protest in an Olympic stage, the whole world would be watching, right? So this was a perfect time to do it, but they also knew if they did this, the consequences for them as individuals were going to be great. Right? So can you imagine as they're thinking about going out on the stand and this is the protest that they're going to engage in, what must have been going through their minds? Or what must have been the feeling in their hearts about this and the tremendous courage that took? But think about the whole world talked about that. And then what was the sacrifice? When they came home, they were hated by millions here, had trouble finding jobs. It was a very negative reaction. It wasn't until just recently, decades later, that people started understanding the courage they had to try to highlight injustice, right? But there's a big but here. The but is they were able to do this because they were athletes. People paid attention because they were athletes, right? The fact that they were Olympic champions afforded them a voice around these issues. Their personal courage emboldened them to make a statement, right? Another example I always think about is Billie Jean King and her pioneering work around gender equality. Right? Think about the work that Billie Jean King did, almost putting the Title IX legislation on her back to make that get passed, right? To make this a more just society and world for all girls and women, right? But think about the personal risks she took. And I always think the iconic image I always think of Billie Jean King was this Battle of the Sexes match, right? People remember this, against Bobby Riggs, a former male professional tennis player, where he challenged her, said he could beat her, and he went out of his way to really kind of mock women and women's ability and women's ability to be athletes, so on and so forth, right? Really, he was kind of pushing the traditional gender role type of piece, and Billie Jean was trying to push a much more progressive notion of equality, right? And think about what the stakes were for her in accepting this match, what the outcome was going to be. If she won, what were the stakes? And if she lost, what were the stakes going to be? And the reason I highlight those things, those are but 2 of a million examples you can think of that because it was involving athletics, people paid attention, right? If they were just random people would not pay attention to this, right? So sport has this power also to help us all think about social change in the ways that other things cannot, right? So if you think about that's one aspect, this whole idea of sport and social change. There's another aspect to this too, is the ability for sport to tackle social barriers and help individuals break them down, right? I always think about my experience in high school. I went to a large city high school in upstate New York, And the majority of my high school was people who didn't look like me, right? Either black or brown folks who were the majority of the population in our school. And since we were a big city high school, we came from different neighborhoods of the city. So my first couple years when I came in, it was really hard. I struggled socially to try and find connection because on its face, it didn't seem like we had much in common, right? As we would just walk through the halls, we're from different neighborhoods, our family structures are different, we look differently, and those differences, it seemed like they were exacerbated every chance we could get. But then came sports. Right? As we started playing sports, it equaled the playing field, if you will. And people started forming relationships in ways that you would have never found possible. And I often thought about, wow, what would my experience have been like in that school if I didn't participate in sports, right? And one of the things I learned was, wow, sport has this really unique opportunity to help us see things in a way that we don't see them on our own, right? So if you think about those are two areas, right? This idea around social change, helping us illuminate social change and see it differently, interpersonal connection and relationships with people that you may not otherwise connect with. And there's another big piece of this too that I always see, there's this transformative power, right, that happens regionally, could happen nationally, could happen globally. So let's think about, so what does that mean? So how can we use this kind of unique, transformative, singular power to impact communities, right? So a couple things. I just want to give you kind of a sense of the depth of how sport is already around us. Right? So I mentioned earlier 162 million Americans claim some type of relationship to sport. Well, think about youth sports, because I think this is a really powerful piece around connection. There's roughly 40 million children that are engaged in youth sports in our country right now. And who organizes that activity? Who leads them in that activity? Right? These are adults. Right? So whether we're coaching, so there's almost half a dozen million coaches. And then think about the parents are involved by extension of their children. So we're talking from 40 to 80 million parents involved as well. Think about the numbers here. And as you think about how deep, I guess, the involvement is already, then the question really is, how can we use that transformative power to help us build community, help us make connections within communities? Because that's the important piece of this. So how does that happen? Right? There's a couple things we need to understand. In my estimation, we need to reclaim sport for what it could be and what it is. Right? There's been too many bad actors that have taken over sport and with a win-at-all-cost mentality. I'll give you an example. There's a colleague of mine who tells a story where he played youth football years ago, and his coach thought he was coaching in the NFL, not in 8th grade, right? Have we met these people before, right? So his coach comes, fully decked out, ready to go, and there was one student who was participating whose parents had him involved in all kinds of things. Wonderful cultural experiences where it would be in the arts and theater, and he would have to come to practice, I believe he said, 1 or 2 days a week, maybe 5 or 10 minutes late, barely late, right? This drove this coach bananas. So finally, about 3 weeks into the season, he calls the young boy over. His name was Martin. He's like, Martin, come here. And the coach's daughters went to private school. So he pulls out of his bag one of his daughter's skirts from private school. He makes Martin put the skirt on and run laps around the outside of the field for the rest of the practice. So think about how influential coaches are for young people and the message that coach sent, not just to Martin, but think about what it sent to all the rest of the boys there about what boys can do and what they can't do. Right? This is an example of the bad actors who have taken over our sports for kids, right? This is the bad example. The flip side, if you think about this, is the idea of there are plenty of good actors who are doing positive things. And my recommendation is, let's think about, understand that we have this transformative power, and how can we use that for positive gain? So there's this notion of sport-based youth development that a lot of communities are taking on now. And what does that mean? Winning is not the primary goal here. Developing young people is the primary goal here. If we know tens of millions of kids are going to participate in sports, why don't we want to use that to help them develop as people, right? I mean, isn't this intuitive? This just makes sense. But we're allowing bad actors to take control and tell us that they know better, right? So one of the things that we insist on is coaches who are adults, parents, they need training. They need to be educated on the awesome responsibility they have to develop young people. They should be working on leadership skills, life skills, servant leadership understanding, right? Things along this line, as they're also developing sports skills for young people. Right? We think this is essential. For young people, they should expect an experience that's safe, right, and caring, and it fosters their development, while it can also teach them the value of being competitive, right? But where those lines work are critically important. So I would say in closing, as you think about the power of sport, right, it's everywhere around us already, and I think oftentimes it is a critical error we make in underestimating its power. So let's think about, if we know it's encompassing, it's kind of like the air we breathe in our community, then how can we use what some people call this evil power for good, right? How can we take that and use it to help people? And one of the things we can really do is make sure we're understanding, wow, this is transformative, and let's make sure we're teaching the right and positive messages, right? And make sure if there are bad actors who are involved in these activities, that we identify them and weed them out. Because if you think about it, at the end of the day, right, you can help people change their lives through the power of sport. And that's what I'm hoping people will be willing to do. Thank you.